Hello, I'm Chris Davis, your MC for today's 2020 Investor Summit on Climate Risk digital program. I'm a Senior Director for the Investor Network at Ceres. Ceres is a sustainability nonprofit that works with influential investors and companies on sustainability challenges, including climate change, deforestation, and water risk. I'd like to start today by saying that our hearts go out to all of those who are seriously affected by the pandemic, and we're especially grateful to those on the front lines risking so much and working so hard to ensure that we all stay as safe and healthy as possible. I also want to thank each of you for participating. We realize that your personal and professional lives have been profoundly disrupted, but your inflappable commitment and courage shown by your participation today is truly inspiring. The generous commitment and support of our speakers and sponsors who've stood by us on this digital journey to reimagine the 2020 Investor Summit on Climate Risk, which is co-hosted by Ceres, the UN Foundation, and the UN Office of Partnerships, is so appreciated and must also be highlighted. We clearly would not be here today without all of your essential support. Somehow, against the odds, we were able to transform our intended in-person convening in New York into a digital program together. The commitment and conviction of so many in our community to address the existential threats, or the dual existential threats, that are plaguing our global community is inspirational. Today's session focuses on the role of asset managers in helping their clients to address the risks and opportunities posed by climate change. As more asset owners recognize that climate-related financial risks to their portfolios, asset managers are increasingly being asked to provide solutions. They're being asked to assess and mitigate both transition and physical risks to companies and real assets, and to create strategies and products across asset classes that enable investment in the transition to a low-carbon, net-zero emissions economy. We are fortunate to have with us today senior executives of 3 global asset managers that have been leaders in developing climate-related tools, strategies, and products. Before we begin today's session, which is entitled Climate Strategies and Opportunities, Asset Managers' Perspectives, I have a couple of housekeeping notes. Please note that this session is being recorded. We will be providing all participants with a link to the recording shortly after its completion. Second, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat box that is located on your control panel on the right side of your screen. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session. And finally, please note that there's a potential, due to global bandwidth issues, that we may experience some challenges. Unfortunately, this is beyond our control. If such an interruption does happen, the discussion will pause for 30 seconds to allow for bandwidth to readjust. We want to thank you ahead of time for your patience in the event that such an issue arises. It's now my pleasure to introduce Jack Enos, CEO of the California State Teachers Retirement System, or CalSTRS. Jack is a well-known and respected leader among global pension funds. He's also a member of the Ceres board and chairs our investor advisory committee of the Ceres Investor Network. Jack, thank you, and please go ahead.
Great, thanks, Chris. Thanks very much for your comments. Climate change is now broadly recognized by many institutional investors as a growing source of investment risk and opportunity. Asset owners, including my own fund, CalSTRS, are asking their internal and external managers to develop robust strategies to identify and assess material risks to our portfolios, both physical and transition risks, and to also offer investment solution strategies and products that enable us to invest profitably in climate solutions as the world transitions to a low carbon economy. In fact, at CalSTRS, this is the theme this year for our investment committee and staff, is that transition to low carbon economy, and really retooling some of our strategies that we need to think about. If you'd like to see what we're doing on our website for CalSTRS, we have a green investment report that details those strategies, and for the first time actually presents our information in a TCFD framework. So you're welcome to take a look at that. We're fortunate to have representatives of 3 global asset managers today, each of which have taken actions to incorporate sustainability and in particular climate risk and opportunity into their businesses. So let me introduce the 3 of them. First, we have John Goldstein, Managing Director and Head of Sustainable Finance Group at Goldman Sachs. We have Rolfing Cooper, Managing Director, Head of Responsible Investment, and Head of Global Client Group for Ireland, Scandinavia, and the United at DWS. And then we have Peter Meny, Senior Managing Director, Global Head of ESG Integration and Research, Global Head of Investment Risk and Quantitative Analytics, and Manulife Investment Management. That's a lot for a business card, Peter. That's a lot. So we've got Peter is coming to you out of the UK. Delphine's in Amsterdam today. John is in Berkeley, I believe.
Yep.
And
in my backyard.
In the backyard of Berkeley. Beautiful. And I'm here in Sacramento for you. So let's get started. We'll just obviously we've got about 4 or 5 questions we'll go through and kind of trade views, and then hopefully we've got time for a couple questions as well. So let me start out with the first one, and John, we'll start with you in that order maybe. What steps and processes is your firm using to identify and analyze climate risks, starting with your public equities and your fixed income portfolios?
Yeah. No, thanks, Jack, and thanks, Ceres and everyone for joining. Excited to get a chance to compare notes in front of an audience with some fellow practitioners. So I think 4 things I'd really highlight. Number 1, I think for us, grounding those analyses in a thesis of how climate change will play out is a really important shaping for all the work that follows. And I think for us, we really try to understand, how does this help us understand and manage risk on the left tail? How does this tap into and access growth opportunities on the right tail and drive efficiency and resilience across the broad base of investments? So for us, understanding the transmission mechanisms of these data, of these analyses, and of the tools, how does that play out in a portfolio? So number 1, grounded in kind of risk, growth, or efficiency. 2, there are a lot of ands that go into how we do that, right? So step 1, and we're going to talk more about this later, but is data. We get inputs from a lot of different places, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into tools, models, and scenarios. But it's combining those data, both traditional and what you think of as less traditional, with good fundamental analysis. People with sector research, sector views. How do you really put those things together? And 3, to scaffold those with the tools that let those actually be brought to bear in client portfolios and in portfolio manager activities. And so for us, for example, that means taking our ESG data and having that in Fluent, which is the portfolio management system our active investors look at as they look at any other financial data. It means integrating dedicated ways in Symphony, which connect PMs to talk to each other. So that integration, it's great to have data and approach, but the systems that portfolio managers, investors actually use day to day is a really important part of making it relevant. I think 3 is break down the silos. And I think there's a version of that that's just within asset management, which is how do we have our quants share what they're learning with our fixed income folks, with our engagement folks, with fundamental equities. And I think we've created a process, a set of, once again, tools and processes to do that, which is really important. It's great if somebody knows something, but how do you leverage the collective knowledge and capacity of an organization? Also breaking down silos across the firm. That's a large part of what I do now in the Sustainable Finance Group is we have learnings from investment research from all across the firm, from firm risk. Right, our own risk managers, as we think about our footprint, our loan book, all these other things, how do we break down those silos and bring that knowledge together so we as an organization kind of know what we as an organization know. And 4, this is a process, not an act, right? This is I don't know what done ever looks like. Every year we're getting a little smarter, but I think that frame of understanding this is a process of continuous improvement, refinement, and learning.
Great, thanks, John. And actually, I want to come back to you a little bit later about the silo issue, because I think that's something we struggled with at CalSTRS. We've been doing this a long time, but it's a constant attention to that issue. Delphine, how about for you at DWS? How does that compare to what Goldman's thinking?
Thank you, Jack, for the question, and also thanks to Ceres for inviting me to this event. And I do hope that our audience is healthy and well. We do very similar things to what John just explained. So rather than regurgitating what we do at DWS, let me just talk a little bit more about one of the things that John mentioned, which we take very serious, which is research. So I do believe that DWS as an asset manager, as a global asset manager, was one of the first asset managers around the globe that identified climate change as a long-term investment trend. We called it one of the 10 mega trends back in 2005. And when our then CEO stood up and said, this is going to be a key mega trend, literally internally, people started laughing, like, you're an asset manager, what does that have to do with climate change? And a lot of our clients also couldn't really understand, why we as an asset manager would care about climate change. So we realized early onwards that education was absolutely key to bringing climate change forward in the investment world. So we launched in 2006 a global research institute that specifically focused on educating our clients and our internal portfolio managers on the issues of climate risk and climate opportunities. And then, to John's point, back in 2006, 2007, there was very little data available. And over the last 14, 15 years, we've seen an acceleration of data coming to the market. So now that we are in 2020, we have written extensively on the impact of climate change from an investments point of view. We wrote, I think, a groundbreaking research report, which was groundbreaking then, about 4 years ago, on the impact of physical climate risk on investment portfolios. Now that there's more data available around transition risk, and clearly we can embed transition risk much better into the investment process and into investment decisions. But coming back to that issue of education, even if you have all the data in the world that you need to measure climate risk or climate opportunities, it is still true that we have to educate our clients. And that's true in the United States. That's true across institutional investors. That's true across retail investors, financial intermediaries. But it's also true. I'm in Amsterdam at the moment, and I would say the Netherlands had a cataclysmic event in 1953 when the perfect storm, the northeaster storm, hit our southern provinces. Lots of people died. Over 1,600 people died in that particular event. And the Dutch at that point started realizing that they had to change. They had to change how the country was managed, because 80% is either underwater or at sea level. And so the Dutch had to educate their people. Ultimately, that led to educating the pension system as well. So they were one of the early adopters of responsible investing. But there are a lot of other countries that came much later to this topic. So we do a lot of the same things that John has described. But I would say one of the things that we take very serious is continuing to educate public policymakers, the private sector, the public sector, our clients, and our internal portfolio managers. If you manage a real estate private equity portfolio, what does climate risk mean? What does it mean if you run a fixed income portfolio? Or what does it mean if you run a European equity portfolio? It means different things in different asset classes. And I'd love to come back to your point as well around silos that you mentioned following John's answer.
Peter, before I ask you the question, I do want to follow up on one point you just made. It just occurred to me because at CalSTRS, we work off and on with our colleagues in the Netherlands at the pension plans. And you're in a country right now where they are a very progressive body of institutional investors. Yeah. Just the finer point you made a minute ago, are you leading the asset owners, or are they leading you in this discussion? I'm just kind of curious how that relationship works for developing that intellectual capital. And you're in such a special place there. Can you kind of talk to me about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's very symbiotic. I think it is a lot of the asset owners, particularly in the Netherlands, but I would also say in Scandinavia more broadly, there is a tremendous amount of focus across all asset classes to invest sustainably and to invest with an eye on climate risks. And just to take the example of the Danes, for example, the Danish pension plans during the September UN climate conference announced a concerted effort across the Danish pension fund industry to collectively allocate $50 billion to climate-related investments, and they now want to expand that coalition, and they're clearly talking to some of the very large Dutch pension funds. And because of our interest in sustainability, our early action with regards to climate investing, we have a number of conversations with them as well. But just to say, it's not the asset managers that lead, it's not the asset owners that lead. It's really a journey together, and I think that's how it should be, and that is what makes this a very healthy development. You know, as we've seen with the pandemic that we're currently living through, if the world can really come together, a lot of things start falling into place. And this is true for climate risk, climate opportunities, and investing as well.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Peter, question for you, the same one?
Yes, thank you, Jack. Thank you for the question, and thank you to Ceres for inviting me today as well. It won't be surprising, I agree with everything my fellow panelists said. You know, obviously we're trying to achieve good risk-adjusted returns for our clients. We look at climate risk, we segment it, as you just outlined, into physical risk, transition risk, and then the opportunities for companies to participate in being part of the solution and open those new markets. So for us, it's really kind of segmenting the risks, understanding where those risks might materialize by sector, looking at the available data, engaging with companies to try and tease out more from that data and really understand how those how well they understand the climate risks, and then choosing to invest. And you know, I think the premise of your question was very right, that I think perceptions of climate change and what it will mean and readiness for that are very different across capital markets and different companies, which gives a lot of opportunity for you know, for us to selectively invest to ensure our clients get the best risk-adjusted returns. I wanted to pick up on a comment that Rolf said about training. I think that's very critically important and critically important across the value chain and with portfolio managers as well. You know, we've partnered with some academic institutions and some NGOs to bring them in and allow our investment teams across the globe to interact with them and you know, really to ask all the questions that perhaps people might be nervous about asking, from the very basics of climate change all the way through to, you know, very technical issues on particular sectors. And that gives our investment teams the kind of the confidence that they understand the issue. It's not just a kind of a slogan, it's actually understanding exactly what happens and having been able to challenge it and really understand what's going on. And then to bring people back in to give them more training so that they can be up to date, because as you said, this is a journey. This is going to change. The science will change, and we need to keep understanding that and understanding how companies are reacting to it.
Great, thanks, Peter. So let's do another round, kind of talking about the quantitative tools and models you all are using to analyze these risks, the physical risks to specific companies, and in particular, what are you doing relative to the question around scenario analysis? So John, if I could start with you again.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things, and in some ways this harkens back to some of the comments Rolfine and Peter have made, is at the core of it has to be a thesis that grounds everything else, right? That connects, you know, what sometimes can be described in language that's not from the investment world into something investors and business people can ground in. And then that helps get people focused on what inputs do I use, how do I analyze those inputs, and how does that map to action, right? Because at the end of the day, I think one of the things that can sometimes be challenging is there can be data and analytics that are either not tied to a thesis, so it feels like an independent academic exercise, or that aren't tied to implementation tools, i.e. something people can go and do, right? And so I think that's one of the things we're very mindful of as we do that. So I don't know there's anything particularly extraordinary about what we do. So what I'd call out are the things where what we do is maybe a little bit different. I think number one, I think, you know, in addition to the usual, you know, wide variety of sources on physical risk, transition risk, underlying data and performance people use, I think we do a couple things additionally. Number one, we use a lot of NGO data. I think we found, particularly we did some work with the San Francisco employee retirement system, and we found that actually NGOs are great sources of data. Like, leave aside, you know, having points of view on a whole host of issues, there's a lot of subject matter expertise that can be used as a data set. And it's a funny thing, we realized when we were creating that framework that most of our data sources were nonprofit. And we spent some time trying to realize why is that? And we realized actually the nonprofit business model is really good for our purposes as a research provider, which is you have people with deep expertise and deep focus that can take a deeply margin negative approach to generating quality insight on something, right? Meaning they can spend a lot of money to get it right. And I think that actually we found is tremendously useful. So I think using non-standard NGO data, both as data and as education, I think to Peter Rolfeen's point is one thing that's a little different. I think too, as I mentioned earlier, try to tap inputs and toolkits from a much wider set of people within our firm. Right, our own risk group is very good at doing some of these things, and I think bringing that to bear is useful. I made a dedicated hire who started last week from somebody that what they were doing for a living was climate stress testing of financial institutions and portfolios. Our quantitative group, just breaking down the silos to that point. There's a lot of expertise next. You actually mobilize it. It's tremendously useful. And I think trying to get that division of labor right in terms of what do you outsource? You're buying inputs, you're buying models versus what are you doing on your own? And I think right now we're going through a pretty exhaustive process. I mean, our last vendor call with a climate data vendor had 45 people internally on it, right, as a reference. Because what we're doing is we're bringing all the relevant people from all the divisions to systematically go through the different inputs to better understand the state of the art, sync our learning. And so I think that's where, in addition to the usual things, some of our approaches may be a little bit different.
Great, thank you. Rolfeen?
Yeah, we have a similar approach, but also maybe slightly different. So central to our overall ESG practice, and clearly climate risk is one of those factors that goes into ESG data analysis. So we started almost a decade ago with building our ESG engine, and that ESG engine now takes data from 8 official data providers. So, they are the likes of Sustainalytics, MSCI, Trucost, and a whole bunch of others. We also take data from NGOs, to John's point. And when we pull all that data together on over 15,000 companies globally, we then ultimately add up with over 2 billion data points. And those 2 billion data points need to be properly interpreted. So we have data scientists who ultimately run this particular ESG engine. And this ESG engine is fully embedded into our front-end portfolio management system, which happens to be the Aladdin platform. So all this data on these 15,000 companies, issuers, is available to every single portfolio manager around the world. And we have 900 portfolio managers across all asset classes. So you can have the best data, but it goes back, and linking back to our previous discussion, it comes back to 1, interpreting that data, 2, educating our portfolio managers on what that data really means, and how they should be thinking about it from a portfolio analysis point of view, from a company analysis point of view. But it also means, again, educating our clients as well as to what data can do and what data necessarily cannot do for you. So data is good because what gets measured gets managed, so that is good. But at the same time, you also have to really educate your people on ensuring that that data is used in the most productive way for our clients.
Rolfeen, I just want to catch on one thing you said around the various data providers that you are bringing into your system. Are you feeling that there is good reliability and consistency in those frameworks of looking at ESG? I've seen some research to suggest that there's actually a quite wide dispersion of ratings for looking at the same phenomena. Does this require you to resort that in some way or retool that, or is there better convergence of thinking on this? Where does that whole fit when you that piece?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and you're very right that you have quantitative data, and then you have qualitative data, and then you have to have a qualitative interpretation of that data too. And you're also right to say that different data sources come up with very different types of ratings, numbers, risk assessments, etc. So ultimately, what we do is the engine itself comes up with a rating system on whatever factor you would like to look at, whether you want to look at certain climate risk, like climate transition risk, or you would like to look at norms violations, or whether you want to look at labor practices or gender diversity, whatever it is, the engine with its over 2 billion data points can send you in the right direction. However, you then need to make sense of all that data. And that is also where the human element comes into play. And so, yes, data provide, to answer your question, the various data providers do have very different interpretations. But we take the view that if you have multi-source data, and you then can analyze that multi-source data, that is better than if you just use one particular data source. So actually having those different points of view creates more insights and potentially creates more alpha for our clients.
Okay, thank you very much. Peter, how do you see these tools and models helping your work there at Manulife?
Well, I'm going to be boring and agree with my fellow panelists again. I mean, we again, I think the first stage in this is to import a lot of data from a lot of different providers, and I agree different methodologies and different providers, but they provide a different perspective, and it really forms the kind of the first step that you build on when you engage with companies to really try and understand how they understand this, and it's that engagement and dialogue with companies that's really facilitated by the data. So for me, the data is a great first step, and obviously quantitative, and then you move on to the qualitative step of engaging with the companies and really understanding what that data might mean. And then I think it's working with other institutions to try and encourage change. So and more data and more disclosure. So for us, I think it's really important that we work directly with companies and in collaboration through the many ways of collaborating to encourage more data and to encourage disclosure about what the data means, and to encourage frameworks that we can all really understand that data well in.
I would just try to kind of on still just to kind of tie the bow on the data point. I think in this field, people say data when they mean actually quite a few different things, right? There are data that are actual underlying quantitative metrics that are revealing of performance. And there are things that are more binary, yes, no, you have a policy. And I think, and then there are aggregations of those things into numbers and scores. And I think this idea that Peter the point he was making, that, better company reported data, better data on fewer things that matter more, is the lifeblood of markets and of investing. And I think ultimately we all need to get to that place. And part of that is making the best of what we got. Part of that is not confusing things that look like data for what are actual data. And part of it's continuing to push the market as we get to kind of this better data, fewer things that matter more space.
Yep. Peter, to that point on better data, since you're on the European side, can you tell me what you think about the efforts of the European community to mandate and develop regulations around reporting of data? Clearly, they're in a very different position than the United States regulators in setting up a formal structure of reporting, and that dialogue seems to be advancing relatively quickly in Europe. Is it going to be useful for us? I mean, do you have confidence that provides what you need as an asset manager?
Yeah, so I think like any framework, it's going to have its positives and negatives. So when you're creating a framework like that, you've got to lay down some very clear rules that everyone's going to follow. And I think that disclosure is good, and making that disclosure mandatory is a good thing, because it means that we'll all have those facts. But I think we're all going to need a lot more data than is in those reports. So I think it will sort of maybe elevate the base level, and then we'll want to build on that data that's sort of going to be available as a requirement.
But overall, you favor the idea of a government mandated disclosure system? You think that's a good approach?
I think at a base level, it's a good approach. Yeah.
Okay. It's important. Let's talk a little bit about engagement too, a little bit. And several of you, Rolfine and Peter, I think you're both involved with Climate Action 100, if I'm not mistaken, and we are too. Obviously, that's an important part of our effort, and this is a global, if anyone doesn't know on this call, it's a truly the most global collaborative engagement initiative ever undertaken by any of us. Talk about how you're approaching engaging companies on climate risk, your proxy voting approach, and maybe if you have an example of where your engagement with your firm, move the ball forward in some way. So, Rolfine, I'll start with you, if that's all right.
Yeah, no, very happy to. So engagement is absolutely key to everything that we do. And we are very happy to be members of the Climate Action 100 Plus network. And as you said, Jack, it's a very collaborative platform across asset owners and asset managers. So for us, having started that journey that I talked about earlier back in 2005, starting to focus on climate change, we then aligned our proxy voting process with the Ceres principles so many years ago, I think 7 or 8 years ago. Yeah. As a result of that, and Ceres does an annual assessment, and they then publish wonderful graphs, and it actually shows that DWS votes 98% in favor of climate resolutions when they come to US annual shareholder meetings. And we've done so consistently over a period of 7 or 8 years. And then more recently, another study was done by Morningstar that looked at proxy voting more on a more wide ESG framework. And again, DWS came out on top with 87% of our proxy voting aligned with broader ESG issues. So for us as an active manager, we are an active manager, a passive manager, we are a real asset manager. But as an active manager, our CEO back in 1993, a gentleman by the name of Professor Christian Strenger, who is still very much involved with corporate governance in Germany, which is clearly the where our headquarters are based. He felt very strongly that as an active manager, we should also use our active voice and vote. And so he started our corporate engagement back 25 years ago. And so moving forward to today and to the Climate Action 100 Plus network, on behalf of the network, we engage with an Italian utility company. That company has made significant strides and significant commitments on behalf of us working for Climate Action 100 Plus. So nothing is more important for investors, and our clients count on us than having that active voice when it comes to voting, but also on engaging companies in moving the climate agenda forward. And I'm very proud that the Climate Action 100 Plus network, including you, Jack, including you, Peter, your respective organizations, have been so successful, particularly with a number of the fossil fuel companies that we're all aware of. Significant progress, and hopefully more to come as we move into the next couple of years.
Rolfine, just one more point there. What made the difference? Let's go back to that engagement you're talking about. What made the difference this time in moving that forward? Is it the mass of asset managers, investors involved in a coalition? Is it the fact that times have changed and people get it that they have to change? Or what were the leverage points that made that engagement successful? It wasn't clear.
You know, I would say, Jack, it's all of the above. But what we really observed, having been early in the area of climate investing, in my mind, the catalyst for focusing on climate and making these changes in our engagement, and for these companies to follow through, is truly the 2015 Paris Agreement. Ultimately, all governments around the world, even if the US federal government wants to pull out of the Paris Agreement, as it said it has, individual states and cities and companies continue to be committed to the Paris Agreement through the Americas Pledge, including the state of California, the state of New York, the cities, et cetera, et cetera. And so the Paris Agreement in 2015 was truly the catalyst, followed by the UN's development of the Sustainable Development Goals. That came on the heels of the Paris Agreement. But then thirdly, also constituencies and society at large is having a very large voice. It is not okay anymore to just do business as business was done 10 years ago. And so in my mind, what has really changed is the Paris Agreement was adopted by all countries around the world. And that meant there was a lag from 2015 to 2017, 2018. There was a lag of what does this really mean? But now when I look at countries that have committed to a net zero carbon economy by 2050, the UK being the first G7 country to do so, the state of California having made that commitment, the state of New York having made that commitment, the EU having made that commitment. Once countries make that commitment, then the next question is, what does it mean for industry? What does it mean for companies? What does it mean for pension funds? What does it mean for insurance companies, et cetera, et cetera? So in my mind, that was really what the catalyst was. And the engagement that we see with the company, that we are engaging on, and the engagement that I see from the rest of the Climate Action 100 Plus, I don't think 10 years ago we would have had any traction. But for the reasons that I just mentioned, that traction is here, and that traction is not going to go away. If anything, I think what COVID-19 has taught us is that that event came as a black swan. It was not expected. The world was not prepared. The private sector was not prepared. The public sector was not prepared. Climate change, we know, is happening today. We know where we're headed. It's going to be an unmitigated disaster if we don't hold on to the climate agreement that we all agreed to back in Paris. And so it is true. Yeah, it's true. We can change the narrative. Sorry, I took more time.
No, it's fine. I want to come back to the COVID piece in just a minute. And I'm watching some questions come on the screen for us that I want to bring into that too. Peter, maybe I would like to hear about your engagement efforts. And do you manage any passive portfolios? I didn't know if you had any as well.
Yes, yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, Robin. You know, the Paris Agreement and the commitment of governments is really important in a way in bringing issues down to companies, because now you've got the commitments at the national level. It makes it clear to companies that this is coming, so these risks will be actualized. And Jack, in answer to your question, mainly we're an active manager. We have a small amount of passive money, but to my mind, what I would call active ownership is the other half of active management. So, you know, we see ourselves as active owners. So we want to engage with companies to understand their strategy and mitigations, and we want to use proxy voting activity to vote when we feel that it's important to send a signal to companies.
So you do engage, that was actually the question from one of our audience members. You engage on both sides of the portfolio, the active and the passive side.
We engage on both sides. We think that's important. Obviously, as a passive owner, you don't have a choice but to be in that company. So in some way, it would be very unwise not to be engaging if you're definitely going to be invested, whatever happens. I found that engagement is a really positive part of what we do. You know, you really feel that you can make a difference, and I think that's one of the reasons that we're a signatory of Climate Action 100, is because when we do it together with other people, you know, that the sort of the power of that engagement is amplified, and the voice we speak with is amplified. We've seen, you know, all around the world a lot of impact from engagement. I can give you a couple of examples. So in Asia, we engaged with a large energy company as part of a collaborative engagement over the last 3 years, and we really worked closely with the people who could influence the low carbon transition strategies of that company. And now that company has disclosed a climate change strategy. They've disclosed a risk management plan, all in their latest sustainability report. And that sets out their intention to align to a less than 2 degree Paris Agreement type of scenario. That's in Asia. And then in North America, we've engaged with a large oil and gas company, and over the course of that engagement, they set an aspirational target of net zero, and then they set some quantitative reduction targets as well. So for me, engagement is great. It's a really positive way of working with companies, of helping them understand things, of bringing to their attention kind of where the world is going and where the risks might be, and really helping to effect change in the interests of our investors.
Great, thank you, Peter. John, I want to make sure, are you on the line? I see you on the cell phone.
Yeah, I my video is acting hinky, so I called in. Can you hear me okay?
It's totally okay. We all get that. I wanted to start with you with this next question, if you can hear me okay, hopefully. And then talk about the low carbon climate solution products that you have created and developing for your clients, and what areas of focus do you think are the greatest opportunities for returns?
Yeah, so I think, a little bit back to earlier when we talked about kind of grounding this in the thesis of, is this about managing risk or looking at opportunity? I think that's a little bit how we sort out the opportunities and how we tackle them. On the risk front, I think we've had a series of approaches to low carbon indexing, starting with our partnership with New York State Common Retirement, extending to work with other institutions. And I think effectively for us, it's going through a process of continuously trying to figure out what are better data inputs and how do we analyze those in ways that give us more insight into climate risk, and then how do we implement that in a risk managed way in portfolios to capture this sort of asymmetry. These risk managed approaches where if you can use modest amounts of tracking error relative to the policy benchmarks that govern many of the large institutions that we work with, including certainly Jack institutions like yours. If we can do that, there sometimes are these really interesting asymmetries where you can get a disproportionate amount of protection relative to the sort of the signal of climate risk with very little tracking error, right? But then what happens is market pricing starts to adapt and we get better data inputs. Back to that earlier comment, it's a process, not an act. So for example, our state-of-the-art approach to this is not the same as it was 5 years ago, and it's not the same as it's going to be 5 years from now. So that's sort of one piece of it, is this kind of constant R&D stream of low carbon approaches in liquid markets, in either passive or quasi-passive approaches, either sort of market cap oriented or factor based. On the solution side, I'd separate kind of public markets from private markets. I think what we were finding in just our active fundamental equities is a whole set of interesting companies who were in some cases repositioning themselves from old line industrial companies to new line climate solutions companies. And actually those are getting woven into broad portfolios, but actually looking at having dedicated portfolios, just really looking at that theme of climate solutions as a growth theme that I think for us works pretty well with active management. I think we've looked at a lot of the data sets on green revenues and others. And then on the private side is actually, frankly, for us, the private solutions is where we've probably been the most active, and I think where we see the most potential in some ways. These are large growth themes that aren't always well understood. If you can access them, where there's late enough that it's been de-risked and it's matured, but early enough it's not yet crowded, you can do well, right? And whether that's finding these niche specialist managers. So Imprint Capital, the impact investing firm I co-founded in 2007 that Goldman acquired, that's what they do. They go find these niche specialists that are kind of in these niches that are emerging. We, on our own, GSAM Wind built what is probably, if not the, one of the largest distributed commercial industrial solar businesses in the U.S. Saw a market opportunity, went out and said, the barrier to entry that allows you to have an impact and make money is the shoe leather required to go do lots of these smaller transactions, right? We just did a project actually at JFK that combines community solar, storage, a whole host of elements. And then our merchant bank, going and doing things like building the gigafactory for Northvolt in Europe for batteries for EVs, that complexity of needing to bring in the off-takers, BMW, Volkswagen, to make that large-scale factory financeable. So the climate opportunities side on the private side is an area I think we've seen tremendous interest growth, and I think we continue to invest heavily.
Fabulous, fabulous. Wolfie, for you?
Yeah, we have done similar things, but let me just give you three examples. In the passive area, for example, we've launched a number of low carbon ETFs, and also to Peter's earlier point, as a passive manager, DWS also does engagement as well. So just want to make that point too, because that's a very important point. But let me bring two private market solutions into the field that are truly innovative, and also I think in both cases are pretty unique, and they're two different ends of the spectrum. So we were approached by a very large US technology company based on the West Coast, and they have a significant supply chain in China. And they were looking, they made commitments around net zero carbon emissions from all their facilities around the world, but they had an issue with their supply chain in China. So ultimately, following almost 2 years of conversations, we created a private equity fund for this technology company. The private equity fund investors are the companies in their Chinese supply chain. And with that private equity fund buys new renewable energy assets that the supply chain can then either use the energy of, or they can use the energy as offsets. And so this was the first time, to our knowledge, that a greening the supply chain of a major technology company was created, finding an asset management solution. And that's quite unique. So that's on one hand of the spectrum. Another focus is around impact investing. So we were the first asset manager who were accredited by the UN Green Climate Fund back in 2015 to build a fund for Africa. So all the African countries also committed to the Paris Agreement. But a lot of these countries do not have the necessary capital to invest in renewable energy to make their countries compliant with the Paris Agreement. So in cooperation with the UN Green Climate Fund, we have developed a fund. It's a blended finance debt fund that will ultimately invest in renewable energy opportunities, solar, mini grids, etc., in Africa to help African countries to meet their Paris agreements. So just to say that you can do a lot in public markets. You can launch lots of climate-related or ESG funds or ETFs or institutional strategies, but also in the private market space, there's a lot that can be done. And let me make a final comment. We are a large private equity real estate investor as well. And in our real estate business, for example, in Europe, we hit all our CO2 reduction targets, and we just re-upped our commitment to reduce CO2 emissions by another 50% over the next 10 years by 2030. So I think as responsible investors, whatever the asset class one is working in, there are always ways to think about how can we make those strategies more robust from a climate point of view.
Fabulous. Peter, your view?
Yeah, and I definitely enjoy and endorse that last comment. I think wherever we have portfolio managers, there's an opportunity for them to make an impact. And the predominant approach we have across Manulife Investment Management is ESG integration, where we're looking at ESG factors, including climate, and we're integrating those into our investment approach. And that obviously benefits the environment and it benefits our clients' returns in our view. We've also developed specific products with climate-related methodologies. So, for example, in our retail segment in the US, we have a product aligned to the UN Sustainable Development Goal for climate action. And then just to kind of build on some of the remarks of the fellow panelists, the other thing we're tracking is kind of growth themes and how they might benefit portfolios around the globe. So things like sustainable agriculture, circular economy, preservation of natural capital, all those things which kind of are really integral in a way to climate risk. So I think, as Rolf just said, it's kind of in every area you can find ways to incorporate climate risk and to have a positive impact.
Thank you, Peter. We've got, just look at the clock, we've got time for each of you to have 2 minutes, and I want to give you this question though, because I saw it come through and I was going to ask it anyway, and it's the obvious, really. The situation we're in now, the COVID crisis, and it's not just about the issue around the virus, but the price of oil, the resulting economic disruption that many of us expect. How does this in any way recalibrate your strategies, your thinking, what you're going to do? John, 2 minutes.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, that works great.
Great. Let me mute myself on the other line, so I'm not echoing. Okay. It was interesting. Somebody the other day asked me, does so now is the E taking a backseat to the S? And obviously the sort of the S has been brought into great prominence. And my quip in the moment, which I believe strongly, is it's not that E is taking a backseat to anything. It's that S is maybe climbing into the front seat along with it, right? that I think the focus, the interest, the appetite, the engagement on climate has not slowed down kind of one bit. And when I think about what we're doing and then what we're seeing, I think a couple of things stand out. I think one is to the engagement point. I think for us, engagement is not just our voting, right? We like our voting policy, we engage with companies, but it's also how we engage with the rest of our business, right? How our investment research publishes research on climate transition and on low carbon transition. You know, how our investment banking team works to do specialized issuance. I mean, during the age of COVID, we've done a couple of green bonds, for example, in addition to COVID relief bonds. And so how we engage in this moment, and I think to the point of what COVID has done, we continue to have a steady stream of C-suite conversations on decarbonization with large companies, both folks at sectors at the absolute center of what's going on and folks more broadly. The pace of dialogues and clients transacting, and we've sort of closed a couple separate $200 million transactions with clients on decarbonization strategies just in the midst of this. You know, it's not slowing down. Engagement activity really continues. I think that said, there's certainly some changes, right? There's some micro near-term issues. You know, while supply chain, for example, for renewables has been fine, we're going to see what's going to happen with tax credit financing in the U.S., particularly with solar, given there's a question of what profits people will have relative to tax credits, right? We've seen tremendous behavior change on a whole lot of fronts. Which of those will persist? Which of those won't? How will that unfold? So I think the general direction of travel remains what it has been. The engagement from clients, whether it's asset owners, asset managers, or corporates, remains high. People are very attuned to the more micro details of what are going on, but it's kind of, in a good way, it's a roll up your sleeves moment. It's not an existential, oh my gosh, we get throw this out the window. It's let's get into the much more fine-grained, the different structures of wind tax equity versus solar tax equity. How is that going to unfold in this particular economic environment, right? Just it gets to be much more specific questions. And then, frankly, we're seeing appetite from both asset owners and from some corporates to ask the question, is now a moment to accelerate that climate transition, right? Is this a moment when things are changing, and a moment of change, do we actually really jump on that as a catalyst to take where we know the direction of travel is move there faster? And I think there's been some of the really interesting conversations we've been having, particularly with corporates on this front. And I think, look, for us, I think, you know, we anchored all of our efforts in this idea, you know, around climate transition and inclusive growth as these mega themes. I think back, you know, Rolfine, Peter, as you all have said, and I think those are resilient. Those are not 6-month to 2-year themes. Those are, you know, multi-decade themes, and none of this is changing that. You know, the moment is an unbelievably remarkable one, but the trends remain the trends.
Wow. Rolfine, just a same question, and then I appreciate your comments on the oil pricing too, and how you see the oil markets intersecting with this.
Yeah, maybe my comment is not going to be specific to the oil market, but I would like to make the two following points. First is, I mentioned earlier that no one saw the pandemic coming, and that the private sector and the public sector were completely unprepared, as we know. The climate crisis, we know, is here. We know will only accelerate if we don't do the right thing. So to John's point, we see that same interaction with clients at the moment, who and companies as well, who say, okay, this was a wake-up call. How are we going to drive the how are we going to make sure that the Paris Agreement gets indeed embedded, and what are the risks? But I want to make a second point that I think goes more to the heart of your question. In 2015, DWS, together with the University of Hamburg, one of our portfolio managers, did a PhD, and we came out with a study that looked at 2,000 academic studies that tried to make a link between company financial performance and broadly ESG. And ultimately, what that study showed is that corporate reputation has the strongest positive correlation to a company's financial performance. And for anyone on the webinar who's interested in this study, you can find it on dws.com. And so corporate reputation is made through this crisis, through this pandemic. Companies that, I'll give you a couple of examples, we know them all, but luxury good manufacturers in France, instead of creating wool gowns, are now creating gowns for doctors and nurses, face masks. They produce hand sanitizer rather than perfumes. Companies that are developing vacuum cleaners or are in the automotive industry are suddenly building ventilators. So there are a number of really good companies who are stepping up, changing production lines, to really help with this pandemic. And
Excellent.
those companies will be rewarded. Their reputation will go up. Those companies will be rewarded over the longer term. At the same time, we've also seen. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I got to cut you off because we're just away. I want to give Peter 2 minutes in here too.
Yeah,
great, thank you, Peter. We've got 2 minutes left for you.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think the COVID crisis really kind of highlights that challenge that we, or at least I personally always find with tail risks, that it's very difficult. You look at things that might happen over the next few months or the next few years, and it's comparatively easy. We know what the world's like, and we think it's going to carry on like that. And getting people to kind of step back from that and think about a real step change, like we've had with COVID-19, and as we have with things like climate risk, is usually very difficult. But when we're in an environment in which we're all now experiencing this totally different environment, pretty much everybody is working from home. Rolf Fine was just commenting on the major changes in the economy with companies undertaking new roles. I think that's really important, and it really kind of helps remind people that these tail risks do exist, and we do need to think about them. And pretty much any of the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, you can think about tail risks that are associated with those. So I think it's in a way an opportunity to bring to re-highlight that to people. And I think also just one other thing is that in this environment, obviously we're all experiencing reduced air travel, or reduced pollution and so on, and perhaps it's just an opportunity to kind of rethink for companies how they do business. They're obviously the companies, I agree, will be rewarded that are treating their employees well and are working to solve this crisis. But it's just an opportunity for everyone to just rethink their business and to rethink as we come out of this how we can apply sensible policies for the climate and how we do business going forward.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, clearly we had it wrong. We needed a lot more than 60 minutes to make this work. You guys have lots of ideas, lots of insights, fabulous panel. Chris is back on the screen, so that tells me it's the time for the handoff. Thank you very, very much. Terrific job. Chris.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you, Jack. I'd like to take time to thank our speakers and all of our attendees for taking the time to take part in today's session. Before we adjourn, I wanted to quickly note or thank our summit co-hosts, Ceres, the UN Foundation, and the UN Office of Partnerships, and all the sponsors that you see on the screen. We'll see who've provided instrumental support for the 2020 Investor Summit on Climate Risk digital program. Please note that you'll receive a follow-up email with a recording of this session very shortly. And for those of you who have registered for Series 2020 or would like to, another session will be taking place tomorrow. Very interesting one on transforming the U.S. capital markets at 12 p.m. Eastern U.S. time with some senior government officials, U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, former U.S. Representative Carlos Curbelo from Florida, former Federal Reserve Governor and Deputy Treasury Secretary Sarah Raskin, and also former Governor of the Federal Reserve. And Michael Kreindler, the Washington State Insurance Commissioner. So that should be a very interesting session on policy. To register or to learn more about other upcoming sessions, go to www.series2020.org. Thank you very much. This session is adjourned.